Hello, and welcome to this episode of Mining Matters, a part of the In Dialogue series hosted by the Non Fuel Minerals and Mining Research Team, led by Dr. Rajesh Chadha at the Center for Social and Economic Progress, New Delhi. We invite experts from India and abroad to discuss how India's mining sector can become a catalyst for economic growth and development, ensuring fair and sustainable mining practices for the environment and affected communities.
Hi, hello everyone, and welcome to the seventh episode of the Mining Matters series. Today I'm joined by Dr. Tom Moerenhout. We today will be discussing on the critical mineral supply chains strategy for India. Dr. Tom Moerenhout is the critical minerals lead at Center for Global and Energy Policy at Columbia University and Professor, School of International and Public Affairs, Columbia University. He's also a senior advisor at the World Bank and a senior associate at the International Institute for Sustainable Development. He teaches also at the NYU Stern School of Business and is a scholar in practice at Columbia University's Committee on Global Thought. Tom's main expertise lies in the role of trade, investment, and industrial policies of relevance to the energy transition, the sustainability dimension of economic globalization, and the economic development of resource-rich countries. Tom has written extensively on India's energy transition and the developments in the domestic capacity for manufacturing green technologies in India, which makes Tom an expert to have this conversation with. And thank you so much, Tom, for agreeing to join us on this topic.
Thank you for having me.
Tom, so just to set up the context for the conversation moving forward, India is currently a highly import dependent is currently highly import dependent for various critical minerals, and the government aims to develop domestically resilient and sustainable value chains in the future. In June 2023, as you know, India announced its first list of critical minerals and identified 33 minerals as critical. The government has completed 4 tranches of critical mineral auctions recently, and 5th is in the pipeline, with a 50% success rate. The auction system has often, however, been criticized for disincentivizing mining investments. Import dependence on mineral concentrates has various risks like high price fluctuations and changes in global geopolitics. Tom, we would want to understand from you, should India continue to focus on increasing domestic mining of critical minerals? And can the same improve within the auction system?
Yeah, no, thank you. It's a very important question. First of all, a very simple answer, yes, I think India should definitely invest in domestic mining capacity. It's the most populous country in the world right now, one of the fastest growing economies. When you combine those two, being dependent on a foreign supplier for critical raw material or processed material supply chains can actually be quite dangerous economically for the reasons that you mentioned, right? You never know with respect to price fluctuations, and not only that, geopolitics, trade restrictions. There's a lot more uncertainty in sort of the global economy and global supply chains than there has been in the past. And so I think that's why India should definitely focus its work domestically as well as sort of diversifying international supply chains, right? And I think there's already quite a bit of experience there, right? If you look at production in India, you have several critical minerals that are actually, very much produced in India, even when you compare to sort of, other averages in different countries. Barium, chromium, zinc, and so forth is very important. Now, of course, when you look, and that's not only the energy transition, if you wish, but also the digital economy and the growth of the economy in general, there are a lot of minerals where India, we know that there's actually attractive reserves that are economically recoverable, right? So not just resources under the ground, but reserves that we actually know that could be extracted of really important critical minerals, right? Things like chromium, zinc, titanium, obviously a very important one as well. Iron as well, and you mentioned it yourself, copper, right? So it's essential for a growing economy like India to really make sure that they can produce some of those things domestically. And I would definitely say there copper, copper has always been known as Dr. Copper, right? So it kind of shows the state of an economy, as well as the price says something about economic development. India is going to be a guzzler of copper in its sort of economic development and its energy transition, right? All of that is copper based. The idea that you would just be importing that from other countries, specifically processed copper, so that's copper cathodes, the stuff that we actually use in components and wires and whatnot. Most of that, comes from different countries, but right now China definitely has quite a dominance over that supply chain. A country the size and the importance of to start developing some of those deposits nationally for sure. I think your question, Karthik, on sort of the domestic concession system, I think is a very good one. I think what is the most important part is that several companies have given certain, comments or feedback or worries with respect to the concession system. To really scale that up, that is a new thing that the Indian government is looking into, right? So any new system is going to need feedback loops. And I think we're in that moment exactly today that, via organizations like CSEP and others, that those feedback loops actually reach policy, right? And I think we're in that moment today. So it's not because the first round didn't always go as hoped for, that second or third rounds won't be able to do that. So I am quite optimistic that if I look at the work that the ministry has been doing and that several companies in India have been doing over the last, let's say, only 3 years, I do see vast improvements, and I hope that that will continue.
Tom, thank you for highlighting the importance of taking feedback from stakeholders like the various companies and then improving policies accordingly. This brings to the next question on how can India strengthen its mineral procurement also from alternative sources like foreign ownership of mineral assets or supply chain contracts, which is rather underrepresented in India currently with other global mining companies?
No, very good question as well. And this is it's an interesting one because so many people are after raw materials and process materials right now, right? So I really feel that India has to kind of push itself in with its elbows out in a way, right? And that's not an easy thing to do. And by that, I mean that the system is so incredibly competitive right now that it's difficult to, as in India, but also as other major emerging economies, it's difficult to basically claim a place, with respect to minerals offtake right now, since the US is after it, since the EU is after it, and since China obviously is after it as well. And they have, more fiscal capacity or more experience in conducting these type of deals and so forth. Now, that being said, I think, needless to say, it will be very important for India to get certain international deals done, right, to make sure that they are an off-taker. And there's, a few strategies that can help with that, right? Number one, I think what is focused on a lot today is these big mining conglomerates, whether they are the quote-unquote Western miners or the big Chinese companies. But there's a lot of other mineral production there that are, junior miners or mid-sized firms that are actually trying to get a footing in the market, and they are looking for partners as well. And partners in this respect kind of means off-takers, right? Buyers. And India can position itself quite well there. And I know that they have been trying to do certain, efforts like that, for example, in Argentina with respect to lithium, right? And so it's good that the government keeps an eye on what are governments doing to make things more indirect investment friendly or not, and then try to tap into that. I think a second one, really not to be underestimated, is the status of India in Africa and for African countries, right? India is a country that has grown very fast, that has been confronted just along the way as growing African countries have today with mineral resources. So there's a deal to be made there. India can really bring not just the investment to the table, but also an experience of basically attracting investment in other sectors, basically developing sort of different sectors, if you wish, right? And I think so if you look at the history of a lot of mineral-rich African countries, and I'm sure that many of your listeners are obviously going to know this, but it's been quite, one needs to watch out with the word colonialist, but it's definitely been sort of an extractivist system, right? Where basically countries come in, do the mining, take them out, and very few economic benefits are shared. If you look at the African mining vision, it's a very clear sort of regional consensus that this needs to stop. They want to do something else. They want to get more benefits from it, whether it's technology transfer, whether it is transfer of know-how, whether it's transfer of economic development planning expertise and so forth. And I think India has a lot to offer there. And so I think India can really become a partner for African mineral-rich countries that, quite frankly, other countries have, are now also an important partner, but have histories that are much more complicated and with respect to those countries than is the case for India.
Tom, a big part of what we have been seeing with regard to China's relationship in Africa as well is that there is a lot of extractive measures that are happening, but the benefits to local communities is not happening also because there is no processing. A lot of processing benefits are not reaching there. We know that processed minerals are valued much higher in price than mineral concentrates. There is an increasing global competition between countries to build their domestic processing capacity and countering China's hegemony. Many countries are using measures like export restrictions, nationalization of mines to reduce export of mineral concentrates, requiring companies to process domestically. OEMs in India currently depend on import to access these processed minerals that are required for manufacturing green technologies. We have had the privilege of reading a lot of your reports, especially the IISc report on lithium sourcing roadmap for India, where you have argued for active support and incentivization for domestic refineries. We want to know more from you as to what strategies have countries similar to India followed to develop their domestic processing capacity, and can India benefit from adopting some of these strategies as well?
No, yeah, thank you for bringing that up. So I think for me, from an Indian standpoint, it might be one of the most important elements, right? What we're seeing today is that with respect to processing, yes, mineral-rich countries want to process as well, more because, as you say, the value increases. But really, there's a dominance from China, and I'm by no means one of these, heavy anti-China people. But if you look at the shares that they have for processed materials, they're unhealthy for global supply chains. It's too much. It's 90% of this, 80% of that. Even if it was, your best friend or your uncle, you wouldn't want to see that. There's just too much risk for disruption and market and pricing power. So to your question, can India process more? I think, first of all, the answer is absolutely yes, and I think it really needs to as well. Because with oil and gas, we often said the one who sits on the raw material, the deposits, has the power, right? And for a very long time, we thought the same way with minerals. So if you have the minerals in your ground, you have the power. But actually, we started to understand in the recent, sort of say, 5-10 years, that actually the processing part is much more important. So you need to know that when you put minerals into batteries or into digital economies or the quickest growing sectors, semiconductors, defense applications, right? What you need to do is process that mineral to the absolute highest purity grade. And that's a complicated thing to do. It's an expensive thing to do. It is technologically complex as well. And so this is something that India needs to focus on. Now, first off, I think India has a lot to offer to investors who think about basically investing in processing infrastructure, right? Sometimes a little bit more than mineral-rich countries. And that's okay. We need to recognize where there is comparative advantage. And India has comparative advantage with a lot of things. Yes, currently the domestic feedstock supply might not be that much yet. And there might be a lot of imports. Fair. But there's other stuff, right? Human capital and technology is one of them. A skilled workforce. India is already a chemical powerhouse, right? You have a cost advantage in labor. Yes, we all know that there's, problems with respect to electricity networks in some states and so forth. But overall, you have extremely good locations with both reliable and affordable energy supply, including renewable energy, right? You have areas where you have the proper water supply for industrial use as well. These are things that are not a given in many locations, right? And so that makes India a very attractive, I would say, location to invest in processing. Now, there are a few things you asked. What can the government or the country do more? The first one, I think, is really making sure that there's a good connection there between the federal government and the state government in terms of selling themselves globally. And that's a bit of a weird thing to say, right? But the federal government has its policies. Some state governments have incredibly competitive policies if you compare it to other countries to come and invest in. But I don't think there's a sufficient sort of cooperation of states and the federal government in basically proclaiming that to the world, in saying to mining companies, this is what we can offer for processing, right? And why is that important is because with processing, your cost curve is very important. And so when companies decide where to invest, they're going to be looking at all of those things, right? ESG standards, labor costs, and so forth. But they're going to eventually make a calculation, including everything, including support policies from the government as well. Where do I think I'm going to fall on that cost curve? Am I going to be more expensive than my competitors or not? And actually within India, it's like you have all of these pieces of the puzzle that are hinting at you're going to be more competitive. You're going to have competitive processing infrastructure, right? But it's true, there's not really a big legacy of processing yet. And so it becomes very important to basically hold the hands of companies in putting that puzzle together. And then maybe, adding some missing pieces in terms of, whatever it can be, fiscal incentives or whatnot, to attract those investors. And I think that needs to be done more. The pieces of the puzzle are there. It's just putting that together in a very attractive package for miners and processors. I think that's sort of the most important part.
Tom, there is also a phenomenon that we're observing more recently in India. Many domestic companies, especially with regard to processing, many domestic companies in India are attempting to procure minerals from end-of-life technologies. And a lot of these companies like Lohim and Altman are doing that work here. How sustainable do you think this method is in the long term? And also, should more companies in India be investing in this form of technology?
Yeah, very much so, because it's firstly, because eventually you'll be able to get, resources out of that, right? Secondly, from a pure environmental standpoint, the level of e-waste that you can have or battery waste is significant. Especially end-of-life batteries, they leak, they explode. You can't really, it's not something that you put in a landfill and you're happy with, right? So you need to get that to a recycling facility. And I think within India, what I've sort of considered as very cool is that you actually also see a lot of homegrown R&D in battery recycling, for example, and that is very good. So I think that end-of-life management as well as urban mining, right? I mean, it kind of is sort of the same thing, but really try to collect some of that waste and reprocess it in India can make sense for several reasons. Number one, there is just a history and a culture of not wasting anything, which is a really good thing to have, and it is in corporate culture as well. If we can use a secondary resource, we are going to. That's number one. I think number two, we all look at these gigantic markets like China and India and the US and Europe and whatnot. India is around the corner when it is about electric vehicles or batteries or whatnot. I mean, basically, you're looking at the amount of resources that is going to be available for end-of-life management is going to be massive, right? Now, you need to plan for that. So the earlier that you develop those technologies, like, you mentioned a few like Altman and so forth are doing, the earlier you develop that, absolutely the better, because then you're ready for when that flow of end-of-life material all of a sudden is ready. And that's how it's going to be, right? It's going to be slow, slow, slow. And then all of a sudden, a major increase of end-of-life batteries. Why is that? Is because demand for batteries shows kind of the same exponential signs, right? So we know that you're going to have the same thing with end-of-life batteries. And the ability there to reprocess or to recycle and reprocess them is something that that would be extremely important, because otherwise what's going to happen is you might be exporting those batteries and actually help your competitors who have built up recycling infrastructure. In this case, this could be specifically China. China has extremely good recycling infrastructure, while you could be monetizing those things at home and basically creating a circular supply chain, which is far more attractive for a ton of reasons, right? Environmentally speaking, in terms of economics, in terms of supply chain security and so forth. So I think there's definitely a lot of potential there for India. Absolutely.
Moving to just looking at end-of-life technologies, currently what we're also trying to understand is how can India strengthen its domestic manufacturing capacity, especially for green technologies. We see that the government of India has made efforts in terms of encouraging domestic manufacturing of technologies through policies like the Production Linked Incentive Scheme, PLI. Some PLIs for solar PVs and for advanced chemistry battery storage systems have observed increased participation from domestic manufacturers. The scheme has also been criticized for not developing the upstream and the midstream sectors, as manufacturers still rely on imports for raw materials and other equipment. India wants to strengthen its domestic capacity and value chains for manufacturing green technology. In your opinion, Tom, how can the government create better incentives for domestic manufacturing of green technologies in India?
So really good and really important question. Again, all those pieces of the puzzle are there as well for India to become a very important clean energy component manufacturer, battery manufacturer, whatever you want. Specifically, also, again, the size of the market. I sometimes have the feeling that, when I engage with India, and, as many people know, I really like sort of working in India with Indian companies and so forth and then organizations. Sometimes I'm not sure you guys fully realize the size of the market that you have. I mean, the level of sort of power to demand certain things from the supply chain will be there, and it will be there very fast. And so you can use that. Now, there's a few things, and you allude to it, that I think, again, will just require some feedback loops. The first one is PLI-ACC that you mentioned, sort of the Production Linked Incentive Scheme for batteries. Those production linked incentive schemes are very important. They're very useful policies to have. And that's the type of stuff, for example, that foreign investors, the technology companies, the ones that you want to attract to India as well, to cooperate with your own Indian firms in joint ventures or whatever else it is. That's what they look at, right? Now, when you have these type of incentive schemes, and this applies, by the way, globally, it's the exact same thing for the US, for European countries and so forth. They often attach certain forms of local content requirements, which is what this PLI scheme for batteries did as well. And then they presume, because we have a subsidy to the final product with the local content requirement, actually that subsidy will trickle down to the rest of the supply chain, if you wish, right? It will go into the cathodes and the anodes and then the mineral processing and so forth. And the truth is, it doesn't really work that way, right? So it's a very good policy to have. I think relying only on local content requirements generally doesn't really work. You need to have some form of support in different segments of the supply chain. So specifically here with respect to processing, and then if we think about batteries, also cathode and anode manufacturing, right? India has huge potential in those things, right? Especially on the anode side. You obviously have really good companies working on graphite, synthetic graphite, and so forth. So the pieces of the puzzle are there, but you will need some more incentives in the different segments of the supply chain. And what is interesting, it kind of links into what I was saying before, some states are offering exactly that, but foreign investors don't yet fully understand that picture, right? Fully understand exactly the level of attractiveness that, Tamil Nadu or Maharashtra, Gujarat, that they have and are offering to foreign companies to come and set up shop in their states so that they can rely on state level incentives, federal incentives, bring their own technology, bring their own technological know-how, and then cooperate with Indian companies to basically build that capacity locally. And I think that last part, and then I'll kind of stop there. That last part is very important. With respect to digital technologies, battery technologies, India has two major things to offer. The first one is it's so damn cheap to do R&D in India, and you get the skill level, you get everything that you need. Like, it's really exciting, and we actually see a lot of companies in the world doing R&D in India. So you're developing that skills. Now you gotta sort of use those skills. Make sure that they don't necessarily escape India to go work in China or the United States or Europe or whatever it is. You want to keep those skills in India. And that you can do definitely through homegrown supply chains, no doubt. But to be competitive in the shorter term, joint ventures are going to be important. Joint ventures with American companies, joint ventures with Chinese companies, with the ones who currently have that experience in scaling production, in standardizing things, who have the competitiveness with respect to technology as well. And it seems that sometimes, and this is not only India, it's other countries as well, they don't really want to go into the joint venture model. They want to build everything from scratch, 100% domestically owned. And I don't think this is always realistic in the really competitive landscape that we have today. And so I think improving those sort of joint venture opportunities a little bit would definitely help as well.
Thanks, Tom. Those are the range of ideas that can be adopted within the strategies that are ongoing. In another IIST report, which is on localizing electric vehicle battery production in India, you recommended the need for skilled labor in battery supply chains. You also made some comparisons to China and what happened there in terms of institutional building for enhancing labor skills. What are some methods that can help India enhance labor skills in this aspect, and what has been your learning from a lot of other countries on labor skills?
Yeah, no, thank you. I think a good strategy includes three components. The first one is making sure that your homegrown capacity is able to scale and to educate. Let's say, for example, we were talking about anode supply chains, right? And I don't want to advertise one company or the other, but an Epsilon Carbon is a very, very interesting company which have been able to develop a very, solid supply chain as well as production capacity. So incentivizing those companies to be able to scale and train other workers is very important. And that can be done through several basically fiscal measures that allow them to potentially deduct costs related to training programs, from whatever corporate income tax, these type of setups, right? That really incentivize that training. I think that's number one. The second part is the joint venture part, definitely important, where again, when I say joint ventures, I don't mean open your borders and allow companies to come in and do their own thing. No, you can, again, you have that massive market potential that we know in the next years is only going to continue to boom. So you can attract companies, but give them very substantial requirements when they set up shop. For example, with respect to training, right? With respect to training and certain labor force that need to be doing particular jobs. These are requirements that you can put. And sometimes international companies like those requirements more than a strict local content requirement. Strict local content requirement, then they need to start thinking about my supply chain, where I'm going to get that. And the calculation becomes difficult. I'm not saying don't do local content requirements. I'm talking about really, really high local content requirements. When they see things like, train labor in X, Y, and Z skills, that's a much easier thing to do in-house, right? So if that is a requirement for a company to set up shop in India and benefit from some of the incentives available at the state and the federal level, I think companies will do that, right? I think that's sort of number two. Number three is definitely universities, polytechnical schools, and so forth, making sure that you have programs available there for people that are interested in the supply chain to really get trained there, and then of course attract good teaching staff and companies to help invest in that and link that up to the labor market. That's actually really important as well, and that, for example, is something we always like to talk about how the Chinese have subsidies and are manipulating the market and unfair trade practices and so forth. Part of that is true. Part of their success story has also been utterly legitimate. And one of the things that they have done really, really well is make sure that there are education facilities, these research institutes that are linked to companies, that are linked very well to the public sector in terms of planning ahead, in terms of industrial policy. They have done that very well. It's a skill that we have definitely lost in the West, that we're trying to get back now. And I think that's something that India should look into as well, sort of those polytechnical schools, universities, and so forth, to link that into the labor market and those supply chains. And I think if you can do those three steps, again, a lot of the skills are already there, but you'll be able to sort of manage those skills in the direction of the supply chain that you want them to be active in.
Tom, while we're getting to the end of our conversation, I wanted to note that you have mentioned a lot about how domestic content requirement is not really the answer to solving domestic capacity. Just as a follow-up, there has been a lot of comparisons drawn to the IRA in the US, the Inflation Reduction Act, and saying that the domestic content requirement was a very strong policy there, which worked in their favor. So could you tell us before you leave, in terms of what worked for US with the IRA, that the domestic content requirement actually benefited them in that front?
No, absolutely. And again, I don't want to say don't use any domestic content requirements at all. That's definitely not what I want to say. I want to say sometimes there's a risk of being too stringent in the short term, and it's actually going to demotivate investment, right? And I think at one point India had the thin film subsidies, which on the solar side of the equation, with also very stringent local content requirements. And it was also a little bit difficult at that time to attract investment because maybe they were a bit too stringent. And again, it's really not only India. You have several examples around the world where local content requirements were very stringent and it was more difficult. Now, you asked about the Inflation Reduction Act. It is true that there you had these quite strict local content requirements, and they did manage to attract some investment. Now, there's a few things there, though. First, behind that local content requirement was a $7,500 tax credit. So that's, if you put a high local content requirement, you also give a very generous tax credit, that helps, right? So that was number one. Number two, a US market that was, again, really, really, ready to scale up EV demand very quickly, right? And I think, India is getting there, is not yet there today. Like, so we see so if you wish, India is that exponential curve where the line is still going up, but not very strongly yet, right? And the US was just before that line was already going up, that demand was already going up very strongly. So you had, for example, your Korean manufacturers, specifically your Korean manufacturers, who were like, okay, this market is going to be massive within the next couple of years. We can sort of satisfy that local content requirement, or we're going to try that. So I think it's also about timing that content requirement very well, which was the case in the case of the Inflation Reduction Act. And then the third part, and it is important, if you look at this subsidy, the tax credit for electric vehicles, that was complemented by other policies, like we were saying before, right? So you had tax credits for battery production in the United States, right? And that tax credit for battery production in the United States, arguably for the battery companies, was actually almost more important than the electric vehicle tax credit. So you had a similar tax credit for mineral processing. Tax credit was smaller, and actually mineral processing really struggled in the US to attract investment. It still does today. But so they had complementary measures within the IRA, specifically to focus on the battery side, where they also said, look, you're going to get a tax reduction for every battery, that you produce. And again here, and I don't want to sound like a broken record, but actually there's a few states in India that have these incentives that could totally rival with South Korea and the United States. But I don't think investors are well aware of the connection between or the availability of both state level incentives and federal incentives. And so I would definitely try to improve that, because then if you have these complementary incentives, then yes, for sure, you can use a domestic content requirement as well. Can I say one more thing? Sorry, I don't want to rant, but it's interesting, right? Say, for example, when the IRA was planned, it's a very fun one. When the IRA was planned, it's a very political process, right? So nobody was really aware of it. And then they enacted this scheme with the local content requirements. And only after that, they asked the question, is this possible? That's actually how it went, right? And so they found out that actually with respect to graphite, which is what you use in anodes, China has so much, dominates that market so much that actually it's impossible to get the local content requirements as planned if you would also apply them to graphite. So they came up with these really crazy constructs where they were saying, a difficult to trace mineral, right? Very small minerals in the batteries. Those will have an extension until 2027, 2028, and then they said graphite is part of that, which is like a completely ridiculous explanation to basically say, okay, we had local content requirements and sort of, origin requirements. And with respect to graphite, those are not going to work. And so my point here for India is you could also try to have that conversation before you write out policies and say, what part of the supply chain can we realistically expect to develop here? And what part of the supply chain might be a little bit more difficult, and we should probably adjust our local content requirements to that reality, right? Sort of that staged approach, I think, is quite an important strategy to have there.
Yeah. Tom, I must say you have been one of the more optimistic scholars on the India front in terms of looking at the future of critical minerals. We often see a lot more critics to the Indian policy, but I think that you have highlighted a lot of potential aspects moving forward for India at each stage of the supply chains, actually, and we think that approach.
Yeah, and again, those feedback loops are important, right? I mean, we all think about industrial policy sometimes as a thing that the government plans with companies and that it needs to be perfect right away. That's not how it works. You try, you fail, you error, you adjust. So as long as you keep those feedback loops open, that is what you need. And then the optimism, yes, of course. I mean, if you think about sort of geological surveys in India, right, it's about 20% that has been sort of quote unquote explored right now. I think the potential is really, really quite enormous, including midstream and downstream in batteries.
Yeah. Thank you so much for spending your time with us, Tom. This has been an enriching conversation for me. I really enjoyed it, and I'm sure our listeners will enjoy that too. And thank you for giving us all the insights that you did on our questions, and we hope our listeners enjoy listening to this conversation as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate it.